Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, we welcome Dr. John Collins. John has been in the Project Censored orbit for a long, long time. He's founder and editorial director at Weave News, weavenews.org, grassroots journalism organization that John founded with his students back in 2006. He's also an original member of the Global Studies Department and a professor at St. Lawrence University. John Collins is the author of Occupied by Memory, a 2004 book on memories of the first Palestinian Intifada, and 2012 published Global Palestine, available in the US from Oxford University Press and in the UK from Hearst. That book uses the category of settler colonialism to explore the globalization of Palestine and the Palestinization of the globe. In 2021, the University of Georgia Press published Globalizing Collateral Language from 9/11 to Endless War, co-edited with Somdeep Sen, which is a follow-up to the original Collateral Language book John co-edited back in 2002. He co-authored Social and Cultural Foundations in Global Studies with Rutledge in 2017 with Eve Stoddard, Emerita Professor of Global Studies. John Collins, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Great to be with you, Mickey. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. We've crossed paths in various circles and worked together, whether it's at Weave News or the great work that you and your colleagues there and students had done, and contributed several news abuse chapters to the annual censored books. And so we're very honored, to again be in your orbit. And you've been doing a lot of important work around the issues I just described for a very long time. John, first, please explain to our listeners, those people that are unaware, about the amazing work that you and your colleagues do at weavenews.org.
Yeah, so Weave News is sort of a small independent newsroom that came out of the St. Lawrence University context, and we're now independent. We do grassroots journalism for social justice, and we have a strong emphasis on sort of local, global connections. We use the idea of weaving, from our name as a metaphor for combating different kinds of, let's say, fear, division, et cetera, that are often created and sown by establishment media. And our name actually comes from the Latin roots of the word for context. And context literally means to weave together. So we do grassroots journalism. We publish work by especially young emerging authors from around the world, all under this general idea of grassroots journalism for social justice.
It's really important work, John. Can you maybe talk about one or two recent stories or things that you all have been covering? I know that you've got several pieces up just from January and your latest news, just to give people some ideas of the kind of stories that they'll find at weavenews.org.
Yeah, so we have a number of projects that are sort of ongoing in series, within which we publish articles as well as just standalone pieces. For example, we have a really interesting series that's a collaboration with some environmental storytellers called Talking Rivers. The series is called Confluence, and we publish first-person pieces from earth guardians, water protectors, people around the world who are stepping up to defend waterways and the rights of waterways. So we've had some really fantastic pieces there. We've also had a number of pieces, as you might expect, related to the situation in Gaza and the efforts by people around the world to stand up against genocide, to stand up for the rights of the Palestinian people. So, for example, again, because we have this global, local emphasis at Weave News, we've published a piece about student activism in Trinidad and Tobago for Palestine. We've published a number of pieces related to Spain and Palestine activism in Spain. We've published quite a bit from Mexico, stories on Italy, Kashmir, trying to focus as much as we can on grassroots movements right now, the threats to them, but also the amazing work that people are doing around the world to work for justice.
Well, John Collins, I guess it's cliche to say that we could use more of that work now than ever, but it does feel increasingly true. The kind of journalism that you're talking about, grassroots, actually more movement type journalism. I think you may have seen in the past year there is more movement in the independent media world to create movement media alliances and connections. Certainly in the wheelhouse of what you do at Weave News. This week we're talking, I'm talking to you. It's January 24th. The program obviously will air into the near future. But this week has been the inauguration week, and we've seen the return of Trump and sort of the MAGA army, if you will, um, really just fast paced. Just before we started recording, you and I had remarked on sort of the whirlwind of things that has even just happened in 1 week. And I just want like to hear at least some of your reactions or responses to some of the things. Maybe even some of the low points that are standing out here. As much as we have been critical, Project Censored's job is to be critical of any public figures in political life. We go back decades, criticizing Republican and Democratic administrations. That's what the fourth estate is supposed to do. All too well, often they end up like lapdogs more than watchdogs, the establishment press do. But just I'd like to hear some things that stood out, maybe to you as things to watch, things to pay attention to, particularly given, your areas of expertise academically.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all of us, in part, I'm just experiencing, sort of the fire hose of very troubling news. Just trying to kind of like deal with the shocks of all of that. At the same time, I don't think much of it is very surprising. I think we knew ahead of time what was likely coming, and we're seeing it. So, in terms of media, there's already been a fair amount of attention paid to the fact that establishment outlets, including some of the major ones like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, are certainly bending the knee in different ways to Trump and to the MAGA movement. Obviously, that's troubling. It's not entirely surprising, but one can sort of flip that around and say, okay, well, this is an opportunity that we can seize in the independent media sector to build networks, a kind of ecosystem that can provide people with access to truth, that can provide people with access to real information, reliable information that is justice oriented, that is truth oriented, and that is maybe avoiding some of the pitfalls of the past that have plagued the independent media sector of competition and factionalism and those kinds of things, right? So if I want to be optimistic or at least, somewhat hopeful, I would say this is a moment to build something better in the independent media sector as a response to the failures and the limitations of establishment media approaches.
In the last Trump presidency, when he was electored in 2016, legacy outlets like the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, a paper that has a long checkered past with the CIA and other nefarious elements, but they did a fact check, right? They made much hay about how many false statements that then President Trump made, and by the time Trump left office, I think the count was somewhere well over 30,000.
Right.
And I want to point out something, and I'm curious, as I'd like to hear maybe I'm certain you have insight on this. The cataloging of it is almost cynical. It's not connected to an outcome. It was if they were just constantly trying to score points, the legacy press, by pointing out the foibles, the faults, the false statements of Trump, but it never seemed to connect the dots to any kind of tangible solutions. It never actually sought to hold him to any kind of accountability. It kind of just became a game, and then the whole fact-checking regime, a lot of people are bemoaning that Mark Zuckerberg and others are moving away from quote online fact-checking. Um, but that kind of outsourcing, uh, at least from my perspective, the outsourcing of that critical thinking and involving media and journalism, that's a real slippery slope. We know too that there were protections in place that were there to protect vulnerable communities and to look at hate speech and protect marginalized peoples. But the flip side of it is Facebook was hired the Atlantic Council, a PR wing for NATO to like do fact checking, which is just as cynical in my view, a different form of cynicism that you'll see at the Washington Post, where they were busy cataloging the false statements, but not really holding anyone to account over it. I'm again curious as to maybe some of your prescriptions about, it's not that we shouldn't be cataloging, but what else should we be doing, John Collins?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mickey. It's a hard one to answer, but I think I would start just by saying that, you know, speaking for myself personally as a grassroots media practitioner, it's not that I'm not interested in kind of cataloging or pointing out the lies, the manipulation, the misinformation, those kinds of things. Of course, we need to try to do that through whatever channels we can. But what I'm more interested in through my work with Weave News, and I think the work that many others are doing right now, is I guess I would describe it as sort of building truth from the ground up, right? I mean, there's an impulse that is behind the work that we do at Weave News. We describe this in our mission statement. There's a democratic impulse, first of all, which is this idea of people's news, right? Like journalism is too important to be left just to those who are sort of inside the beltway and wrapped up in their access journalism and so forth, right? It's too important for that.
And
So there's the
small d
democratic
Democrat, right?
impulse.
Sorry to interrupt, but small d
Absolutely.
Democratic. I got what you were
Small
saying, but I,
d.
I definitely want to I definitely want to make sure the audience is aware that you mean small d Democratic. It's not a partisan affair, it's a public affair.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
And, many folks who are listening to this, I'm sure, are familiar with the history of, projects like indie media, right, which sort of radically crowdsource news. Okay, so there's that history, and there's things that have worked well and things that have not worked so well. What we do is, we have an editorial structure in place, right? So we're not just accepting things that people send us from anywhere for any reason, right? But we do have this democratic impulse that says if we can sort of pull together stories from people who are on the front lines of struggles for change and then begin to weave those together, what we can do is build a kind of truth that is, let's say, a networked idea of truth that's woven together, right? So that all of us, including the grassroots journalists themselves, can understand better how what's happening to us where we are is organically connected, structurally connected to what's happening to other people in other places. And that's why I find so many of the stories that we've been publishing so powerful and so inspiring.
well, they certainly are. And historically, I mean, again, a bulk of your work and your concentration, around globalization does look at marginalized populations. Certainly, you've been looking at what's been happening in Palestine for a very, very long time. And even though folks that run in our circles are well aware of how long this has been going on, this kind of oppression um, that's been happening in the Middle East in particular against Palestinians. Um, Still, a lot of folks, if you do look at the establishment press, it's as if something just happened on October 7th, 2023, right? We do
Right.
live in the United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal once quipped, but I think it's almost a more pernicious affair where you can't forget things you weren't taught in the first place. And there's been a long, long memory hole around Palestine, just going back decades and decades, right? Where it kind of something pops up in a certain administration usually under some global political kind of affair, never from the lens of an oppressed people, right? It always has to connect to global politics and transnational capital and everything else. But if you could, and we're going to continue this. We have a few minutes before the break, and we're going to continue after. But what drew you, you just described what you do at Weave News. What drew you to, those types of struggles, and what drove you to want to learn more about and help amplify and tell those kinds of stories?
A lot of it comes from my own family. I was brought up in a family that was very, heavily involved in some of the justice struggles of earlier times. Not just the struggles of the 60s that my parents were involved in, but also my grandparents before that, doing peace work, doing anti-racist work, so forth. And when I went to college, I did a lot of studying of the history of colonialism, the role of the United States and U.S. foreign policy around the world. The Palestinian issue jumped out at me right away, in part, through the influence of friends and things that I was reading, Edward Said's work. It jumped out at me as something that was tremendously urgent and that I, as a US citizen, had a responsibility to speak up about, right? But also it was a kind of, and I slowly began to understand this over the years. Palestine has a kind of optic for understanding so many things about the world, right? So if you want to understand global capitalism, if you want to understand neoliberalism, if you want to understand militarism, if you want to understand technology, and especially the dark side of technology, if you want to understand media and the politics of representation, looking at that through the lens of Palestine is incredibly insightful, educating, um, and it's not about saying, okay, well, the stuff that happening to Palestinians on the ground is not important. We focus on that as well. But for me, it was both. It was like, I need to go there. I need to see what's happening. I need to write about that. I need to do my part. But also, I need to sort of use that as a way to ask a whole set of larger questions. And that's what my Global Palestine book was about, and some of the news analysis work that I've done at Weave News and elsewhere.
Yeah, it's very important work. In this segment today, we are talking to scholar John Collins, Emeritus Professor of Global Studies at St. Lawrence University. He is also one of the major forces behind weavenews.org. We've been talking about the work of Weave. We've been talking about some of John's scholarly work. John, in addition to publishing numerous books, other academic studies, including Occupied by Memory and Global Palestine, John and some of his team members at Weave News have contributed news abuse chapters to the annual Project Censored books. And before the break, of course, we were talking about what was going on with Palestinians and in Gaza. And so it's again no surprise that John Collins has been looking at this issue for a very long time. And actually, that was part of what you contributed to the censored annual volumes, because unfortunately, going back decades, we've long covered stories about Palestine because they don't get, if they get covered at all, right? If they get covered at all, it's usually through a very distorted frame. And we don't really get to hear the stories on the ground. And recently, in just the past year, there have been extraordinary efforts by legacy media to bend over backwards, if not outright ignoring, to try to filter, euphemize, talk around, justify, you name it, anything but get to the core truth, even when it's staring flat in the face. The whole thing driving the TikTok ban was about Gaza coverage. We heard that come right out of Mitt Romney's mouth, Anthony Blinken's mouth in the summer of 2024. That was one of the main political drivers of the TikTok ban because they couldn't control it. It was a Chinese company that ran it, and they didn't like the coverage that was going on. So, John Collins, let's talk a little bit more about your focus on that on Palestinians, and let's talk about some of the media issues, media problems, the very things that Weave News was created to address, the very kinds of stories, that helped create Weave News to help tell and amplify those kind of stories. So, John Collins, let's hear more about that. And I know you want to talk more about settler colonialism and sort of the absence of that frame in legacy press. John Collins.
Right. Yeah. So the way I'll get into this is to talk a little bit about some research that I did, which I ended up publishing as a series for Weave News called "The Deepest Fake News," And what I was trying to do there was to understand um, how settler colonial situations. I'm most interested in Palestine, but I also looked at North America and Australia as other cases, how those situations are covered, right? When there is conflict, when there is indigenous resistance, when there are movements happening that sort of bubble up into the news. Okay, so it is covered, but how is it covered? What's there? What's missing? All right, and so what I focused on was the concept of settler colonialism itself, which is obviously a concept that is has inherent truth value for any indigenous person, for any colonized person. Um, and yet, that concept, which has tremendous explanatory value, right, is essentially absent from establishment media coverage in the United States. I looked at CNN, I looked at NPR, I looked at the New York Times, in relationship to a number of these cases. So, as a way of getting into this, I drew on an insight from a sociologist named Mark Ayesh, who I'd interviewed for the Weave News podcast. And Mark talked about how when Palestinians appear in the news, and they do often, right? I mean, Palestine is heavily covered in many ways. When they appear, at best, they're sometimes given the opportunity to say, "This is what has happened to me. My home was destroyed.
At
My
best.
father was arrested." At best, right? So the way that Mark explained it, which I thought was just really insightful, was that they're given the opportunity to say, A, B, and C happened to me. But if given the chance, they would also explain very clearly why,
Mm.
right? The why, the context. Okay, it's because there is a colonial project that is an ongoing project. It's because there's a belligerent military occupation in my homeland. It's because of the U.S.-Israeli alliance. It's because of et cetera, et cetera. And it's that context that is often just sort of inadmissible from establishment media coverage. So we can think about this as a kind of explanatory vacuum. It's like there are events happening, people are hurting, there's violence and so forth, but there's an explanatory vacuum. And when there's a vacuum and you cannot fill it with concepts like settler colonialism that would explain very clearly what's happening, then what does it get filled with? It gets filled with ideas that are sort of default ideas given to us by the dominant ideology, right? And that is a tremendously impoverished form of coverage.
Well, and an example of that kind of dominant narrative is that I strongly agree with your categorization of that when Palestinians are part of the coverage of the from legacy news outlets, um, they might at best get to talk about some of the things happening, but usually they don't get a chance to do that until after they take some kind of weird loyalty oath. Almost invariably, some news anchor, caster, what have you, that can't always dignify those people with a label of journalist, but they usually ask some question about if they denounce Hamas, or
Mhm.
if they denounce anti-Semitism, as if these people don't like understand the broad definition of Semite, or right. It's almost like a ritual in the Western press that if somebody's on and they get a chance to talk about the extraordinary degradation and destruction that's happening in their lives, they have to first pay fealty to the West, before they're allowed to maybe get a chance to say at best, John Collins.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's been a pattern for a long time. And I will say that under the horrific conditions that we've been seeing in Gaza since Israel launched its genocidal assault, um, one of the things that's come out of that is a tremendous effort by many, many people, beginning with Palestinians themselves on the ground, and the courageous journalists who've been targeted, of course, for their work, right? But who are on the ground and trying to get the word out and essentially forcing media outlets to pay attention to say this is happening. It's the images are right there. You must acknowledge this, right? And so there has been some inroads, right, into the coverage. And yet the kind of patterns that you're talking about are still there. I'll give you an example. Just the other day, I was listening to what in many ways was a good interview on NPR's Morning Edition with Diana Buttu, who's a fantastic Palestinian lawyer. And she was, responding to questions from the host, and she referenced the fact that there is an ongoing genocide happening in Gaza. And you could tell that the host immediately was like almost interrupting her just to say, okay, yes, Amnesty International has said this and so forth, but the Israeli government has denied that,
Both
so
sides.
thinking about liability rather than thinking about, what is actually happening. And so those patterns, they shift, they morph into other things, and they morph in part in response to courageous efforts to build other kinds of narratives, right? And we have to acknowledge those, right? It's not all bad news. It's that there's a lot of great work that's happening that is getting the attention of the establishment, and then the establishment responds in the ways that it does.
Yeah, they respond with the tired tropes of accusations of anti-Semitism. They're pretty rank, and they're pretty widespread. That uh, even the most tepid questioning of Netanyahu's government can get one in some kind of hot water, with the finger wag of like, you're starting to sound like those radical anti-Semitic protesters on America's college campuses. And that's just a chilling effect that goes, across the culture for people that just decent regular people that see those images, right? And see the things happening and saying, how can you actually continue to just ignore this? And as you said, so then the legacy press, well, maybe they won't ignore it, but they obviously go through a certain lens and they really frame those narratives. They have that weird kind of loyalty thing. Here's the thing, though. Even if you say the most factual thing about what Israel, the IDF is doing in Gaza or the West Bank, they'll get all over you about anti-Semitism. But then Elon Musk walks across the inaugural president stage on the 20th, doing what appears to be the right arm chest Roman salute. And the ADL bends over backwards to call it an awkward gesture. And no one wants to really peer back beneath the curtain and look at just how absolutely authoritarian so many of the things that people like Musk, and of course policies that Trump promotes, and of course Project 2025. So there's a real clear double standard there, along with the both sides in game. John Collins.
Yeah, we're seeing that all over the place right now. I'm actually working on a piece now about some of the coverage of Elise Stefanik's confirmation hearing.
Mm.
Right now, Stefanik is I know Stefanik not personally, but I'm very familiar with her political career because I live up in northern New York and in the congressional district that she represents. And so I was very, struck by the coverage of this hearing where, among other things, she was asked by members of the Senate committee about the Musk, fascist salute. And, she said, no, that's not what it was, and so forth. And then she immediately pivoted to saying, and, I have a very strong record of opposing anti-Semitism, right? As if the only thing that a Nazi salute can mean
Yeah,
is in relationship to the issue of anti-Semitism, not even recognizing what fascism
is.
is, right? All of the other things that fascism is, but also the complete failure of journalists to see through the kind of to stop validating or normalizing a worldview from Stefanik that somehow Israel represents all Jews, that Zionism equals Judaism. I mean, all of these faulty assumptions that are built into the dominant perspective that Stefanik was sort of repeating in that. So, good journalism would point out the fact that there are many, many Jewish organizations that have
Many.
spoken up against this genocide, that are moving away from Zionism or have never been Zionist to begin with, right? And that to say, well, I support Israel, therefore I'm against anti-Semitism, is a tendentious claim that must be critiqued and must be analyzed.
And that's what journalists are supposed to do. I mean, journalists aren't just supposed to say he said, she said, they said. they're supposed to connect dots. They're supposed to help provide historical context in order for the public to be able to ask additional questions or to gain broader understanding that might lead to more meaningful civic engagement. I mean, even though there's not a lot to be civically engaged with at the top level, we go back a decade or more at Northwestern that the American public has almost no influence at all on like what goes on with the presidency and so forth. Our system is so completely divorced from theoretical democratic republicanism, small d, small r. Um, but John Collins, we have in the few minutes we have left, let's flip a little bit and see what are some prescriptions you have for the press. What are some, and you live it at Weave News, you practice what you teach, right? Maybe talk a little bit about what you see are better ways forward. What kind of coverage should we be seeing, and what are some things that you think people listening here might do other than throw their hands up in despair? What are some things people can do to really make some difference in the world?
That's a gigantic question with many possible answers. And I guess I would begin by saying that there are a lot of people out there who are building those answers right now, right? And our organization is one of many. And so I would encourage, listeners to seek out the independent media, the worker-owned media, all of those outlets that are on the front lines that are doing the work right now. And I have many friends, for example, who've come around to the idea that, I shouldn't be paying a subscription to the Washington Post, given the way that they're acting right now. Okay, well, take those resources, take that time and move it to those who are doing truly independent journalism. In terms of what's needed in the coverage, I mean, I think given that the state is at this point, being actively taken over by a thoroughly anti-democratic movement that has no regard for truth. Um, Obviously, the press has a responsibility to go beyond simply reporting what those folks are saying. Okay, so the Washington insider media model, this is a moment when, the model that the rest of us in the independent media have been following for years becomes especially relevant. There are people all over the world who can report on what's happening. They're seeing it, they're living it, it's happening in their communities. And with a little bit of like editorial support and so forth, those voices can come through, right? And help build a different kind of understanding. Palestine is a great example of this, right? I mean, what we've been seeing in over a period of really decades, but especially in recent years, is the emergence of a kind of like insurgent common sense. Like, of course, Palestine is a colonial situation. More and more people understand that and are becoming less and less afraid to say that, right? And it's because those grassroots voices are getting into the conversation. We need more of that.
We absolutely need more. And John Collins, we're out of time for this segment, but I wanted to thank you for all the amazing work you've done, not just the scholarship and the teaching and all that you've given us to think about over the years, but also the incredible work that you do as editorial director and founder over at weavenews.org. Again, you're a classic example of someone that practices what they teach. And if we could replicate those models, John, and replicate what you're doing at Weave News, I think we would be going even further into addressing not just addressing the challenges that we're facing, but also look towards the solutions and really give people hope that we're the people that are going to have to bring about solutions. We the people. I don't think we're going to be able to rely on morally bankrupt leadership here in the U.S., in the West in general. John Collins, anything you want to share with folks about where they can follow your work or follow you on any other platforms?
Yeah, first of all, obviously, weavenews.org. We're on social media at Weave News. I'm on social media at DJ Leftover. That's my handle that I use everywhere. I write often for Weave News. I also write occasionally for other outlets like Truth Out. I published also in Spain at La Marea, which is a fantastic independent outlet over there in Spain as well. And I look forward to interacting with some of your listeners as they become more aware of what we do at Weave News And many thanks to you, Mickey, for all the great work that you've been doing for so long.
John, it's an honor to have you on the program. We definitely love to have you back, and we certainly can have many of your colleagues come on the program and talk about the ongoing work that you're doing. And I know that you're all going to be doing the next several years during the Trump presidency. WeaveNews.org is the site. I've been speaking with Emeritus Professor of Global Studies, Dr. John Collins. John, thanks so much again for joining us today on the Project Censored Show.
My pleasure, Mickey. Thank you.